This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 117, Zachary Dutro-Boggess. The day after his 4th birthday, Zachary Dutro-Boggess was rushed to a hospital in Portland, Oregon, suffering from suspicious internal injuries. After Zachary died on August 16, 2012, his mother, Jessica Dutro, and her boyfriend, Brian Canady, were charged with murder, accused of beating Zachary to death, as well as abusing 2 of Jessica's other children. During Jessica's trial in 2014, Zachary's story went viral after a Facebook message was introduced into evidence in which Jessica referred to her toddler son using a homophobic slur, telling Brian that Zachary walked and talked as if he was gay and that Brian would need to work on her son. The prosecution was convinced that her homophobia was Jessica's motive for abusing Zachary more severely than the other children, eventually murdering him. This is the disturbing story of Zachary Dutro-Boggess. Before I get started, shout-outs to my newest patrons, Kelly C. from Chesaning, Michigan, Stephanie C. from Colorado Springs, Colorado, and from somewhere out there, thank you to Rebecca O., Cassandra R., Madison, and Amy R. I truly can't thank you all enough for helping me keep the podcast going. To make a pledge, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod, or to make a one-time contribution, you can go to sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com/support. This episode continues my focus, in honor of Pride Month, on cases involving an LGBTQ aspect, whether the child involved identified as part of the community or the caregiver acted with violence after making assumptions about the child's possible sexuality. Sadly, today's story is one of the latter. Much like little Ronnie Paris, whose story I told 2 weeks ago in episode 115, Zachary was just preschool age when he was murdered by a parent who thought he might be gay. Quick shout out to the Oregonian newspaper, which was the main news outlet covering Zachary's case from start to finish. The lion's share of my research for this episode came from an extensive series of their articles, most of which were written by reporter Emily E. Smith, so I felt that was worth mentioning. Let's get into the story. Zachary Dutro-Boggess was born in Hawaii on August 13, 2008, to 19-year-old Jessica Analani Dutro and 20-year-old Zachary Paul Kamikokalani Boggess, who, for the purposes of this episode, I'll call Zachary Sr. Little Zachary was the second child of the couple, who also had a daughter born in 2005 and would go on to have another son in 2009. When Jessica was pregnant with Zachary in May of 2008, both she and Zachary Sr. were charged with and ultimately convicted of assaulting her mother's foster son, whose care had, according to court records, at some point been shifted to Jessica and Zachary Sr. As a result of this incident, the couple's daughter was removed from their care, as was Zachary when he was 4 months old. The 2 children were placed into foster care for over a year with a loving woman named Carlene Cruz, who went by Kate and who provided the media with all of the very few photos of Zachary that are available online. Ultimately, Jessica pleaded guilty to 3rd-degree assault for the attack on her mother's foster son and was sentenced to 30 days incarceration, with 22 of those days suspended. She was also ordered to complete anger management and parenting classes. Within a year, she had also been convicted of petty misdemeanor shoplifting, the sentence for which was apparently rolled into the sentence for her 3rd-degree assault conviction. Zachary Sr. was charged with felony abuse of a family or household member, accused of intentionally choking the little boy, And on top of being sentenced to a year's incarceration with 9 months suspended and 5 years probation, he was also ordered to complete anger management and parenting classes, as well as not to contact the victim. At some point during this whole mess, the couple evidently broke up. In December of 2010, for reasons I wasn't able to find, Jessica took the 3 kids she shared with Zachary Sr. and moved with them to Oregon. Soon after moving to the mainland, Jessica began dating 22-year-old Brian Cody Canady, who by the end of 2011 was not only her live-in boyfriend, but also the father of her 4th child. After Brian lost his job in the summer of 2012, the family of 6 moved into a homeless shelter in Tigard, Oregon called the Good Neighbor Center, which provides living quarters similar to apartments for families in need. According to staff at the time, the shelter had 9 rooms for families and did not provide housing for single individuals. Families typically stayed at the shelter for about 6 weeks before obtaining housing of their own, and during their stay, they were given meals and access to programs, such as one mandatory program teaching life skills for adults, such as anger management. Jessica, Brian, and their children had been staying at the center for about 5 weeks when, around 7:45 a.m. on Tuesday, August 14, 2012, Jessica awakened the children for breakfast, but it was immediately apparent that something was wrong with Zachary, who had turned 4 years old just the day before. Zachary had wet the bed, Jessica discovered, so she carried him into the shower. However, Zachary's body was limp, his eyes rolling, and he was unconscious and could not be revived, so they called 911. Shortly thereafter, paramedics arrived at the Good Neighbor Center and rushed Zachary to Providence St. Vincent Medical Center in Portland. At the hospital, Zachary stopped breathing, and medical staff performed life-saving measures before transferring him to Randall Children's Hospital at Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center, also in Portland, where he was placed on life support. When staff at the Children's Hospital confronted Jessica and Brian with the fact that Zachary had suffered internal injuries, they claimed they didn't know what caused them. Zachary had suffered 2 small perforations to his small intestine, causing the contents of his bowel to leak into his abdominal cavity. A doctor told the couple that blunt force trauma had caused Zachary's small intestine to press against his spine, causing the perforations, but they continued to claim they had no knowledge of how Zachary's injuries had occurred. The day Zachary was hospitalized, Jessica and Brian continued to assert their ignorance when they were interviewed in a conference room at the hospital by Tigard Police Detective Yon-Soo Lee. Brian told the detective they had moved into the Good Neighbor Center after he had lost his job. Although they had been at the shelter for about 5 weeks, he said, they were in the process of gaining housing of their own. The couple, who said they had been dating for about 2 years, told Detective Lee that during their time in the shelter, no one else had cared for their 4 children. Brian had the audacity to tell the detective that Jessica's older 3 children did not grow up with their biological father, and that Brian himself was the only father that they have known. The following day, while Zachary remained on life support, Detective Lee once again interviewed Brian and Jessica. During this interview, Brian gave several accounts of how Zachary's injuries had occurred, first saying he may have accidentally stepped on the 4-year-old during the night, and then saying that when he kicked the air in anger, he had accidentally delivered a roundhouse kick to his girlfriend's son. I think that's the first time I've ever heard of an accidental roundhouse kick. I keep thinking at some point I'll have heard every stupid excuse at least once, but I'm continuously surprised by the moronic creativity of these child abusers. At some point during the interview on August 15th, Detective Lee read Brian his Miranda rights, after which Brian admitted to abusing Zachary. On multiple occasions in the past, Brian said, he had beaten Zachary with a belt and kicked him in the legs. Around 8 p.m. on Sunday, August 12, 2012, Brian told Detective Lee he got into an argument with another shelter resident. When he returned to the family's private living quarters, he said, he was still angry and told Zachary to sit down in front of the television. Instead, he said, Zachary wanted to take off his shoes, so Brian told him again to sit in front of the TV. When Zachary again didn't listen, instead going to the corner to remove his shoes, Brian, who was still wearing shoes himself, kicked the 4-year-old in the abdomen. The impact caused Zachary to fall on his bottom, and he started to cry. Brian and Jessica both told the detective that they later noticed that Zachary was suffering signs of illness, like vomiting and diarrhea, but they didn't think he needed medical attention, even when the symptoms persisted into the next day, which was Zachary's 4th birthday. On that day, Brian said, He told Jessica about the kick he delivered to Zachary the day before, but they still did not seek help for the sick little boy. When Zachary woke up to use the bathroom at around 4 a.m. on Tuesday, August 14th, they noticed, according to the probable cause affidavit, that Zachary was doing far worse and was exhibiting altered levels of consciousness, as well as difficulty walking without assistance. Still, they did nothing to help him until he was unable to be awakened at 7:45 that morning, at which point they finally called 911. Both admitted to Detective Lee that they knew Zachary's worsening health issues were related to the kick Brian dealt him on August 12th. The affidavit read, Brian Canady admitted that he did not seek out medical attention for Zachary for fear that his abuse would be discovered. Brian also admitted to Detective Lee that he has physically abused the children in the past. Now for a quick sponsor break. Stress is the most common cause of tooth grinding and day clenching. Some of the stories I tell on this podcast are incredibly stressful, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to hear that after listening, some of you find yourself clenching your jaw or grinding your teeth in your sleep. Clenching and grinding leads to erosion of the tooth enamel, can cause cracked or chipped teeth, makes you susceptible to heightened tooth sensitivity, and may even result in infection. Once you lose that enamel, it doesn't grow back. It's gone forever. Fixing these dental problems can be super expensive. Crowns can cost anywhere from $800 to $3,000 per tooth. Veneers can run $400 to $2,500 for each tooth, and replacing your whole mouthful of teeth with implants can set you back anywhere from $7,000 to $90,000. The better option is prevention, right? Dentists offer night guards to protect your teeth, but they can cost anywhere between $225 and $600, not even counting the dental visit. Smile Brilliant, on the other hand, creates custom night guards for as low as $45 per guard. Depending on the package you purchase, reorders can be as low as $25 per guard. Smile Brilliant keeps a digital file of your dental impressions, making reorders at smilebrilliant.com absolutely hassle-free. You can visit smilebrilliant.com and use my promo code CHILDREN for 20% off your custom night guard. That's smilebrilliant.com, promo code CHILDREN. While you're there, you can also shop for custom-fitted teeth whitening trays, whitening gel, electric toothbrushes, water flossers, and much more. By supporting Smile Brilliant, you're also supporting the show. That's smilebrilliant.com, promo code CHILDREN. Three days after his 4th birthday, on Thursday, August 16, 2012, Zachary Dutro-Boggess died in the Randall Children's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. According to a doctor who spoke with Detective Lee, had Zachary received adequate medical attention soon after receiving the abdominal trauma, there would have been a very high likelihood that Zachary would survive the injuries. An autopsy determined that Zachary died from blunt force trauma to the abdomen, which had led to intestinal perforations that caused a severe infection. In the medical examiner's opinion, the injuries occurred approximately 24 to 72 hours prior to the 911 call. On Monday, August 20th, 2012, 23-year-old Jessica Dutro and 23-year-old Brian Canady were arrested at their workplaces and booked into the Washington County Jail. Jessica on charges of first-degree manslaughter and criminal mistreatment, and Brian on charges of murder by abuse, assault, and criminal mistreatment. Both were accused of causing Zachary's death, as well as abusing him, his 7-year-old sister, and his 3-year-old brother, all of whom were Jessica's children with Zachary Boggess Sr. The child Jessica and Brian shared was apparently unharmed. The 3 surviving children were taken into custody by the Oregon Department of Human Services and ultimately placed with members of Jessica's family. In initial media reports about the case, Zachary's name was not released. Tigard police spokesman Jim Wolf told the Oregonian that police weren't sure who placed the initial 911 call, but multiple people from the shelter did call for help. Of the shelter's staff, he said, "They did everything possible." Police had no indication that a weapon was used in the attack on Zachary, which they believed took place in the family's private living area at the shelter. Wolf said, "This is something that staff wouldn't have had any knowledge of." He told the newspaper that police weren't certain where the family had lived prior to their stay at the Good Neighbor Center, and he wasn't aware of any previous contact between the family and Tigard police. Good Neighbor Center Executive Director Jack Schwab spoke to the Oregonian shortly after Jessica and Brian's arrests, telling reporter Rebecca Wollington that the staff at the shelter were strongly affected by Zachary's murder.
"We're in the business of providing a safe harbor to families. It's a hand up, not a hand down. The fact that this happened is just devastating."
Mr. Schwab declined to comment on what involvement his staff had in the case, saying,
"I would love to leave you with the impression that we're knights in shining armor, but I just can't give you any of those details because of the ongoing investigation. But I will say that we are mandatory reporters under Oregon state law. We are very vigilant about reporting any signs of abuse."
The murderous couple was arraigned in Washington County Circuit Court at 3 p.m. on August 21, 2012. 3 days later, on August 24th, Zachary Boggess Sr. filed for divorce from Jessica Dutro in Oregon's Washington County Circuit Court. At a bail hearing on Friday, March 15, 2013, Brian Canady and Jessica Dutro appeared in jail scrubs before Circuit Judge Dawn Letourneau. At the hearing, the court heard testimony from Tigard Police Detective Yan-Soo Lee and Dr. Danny Leonhardt, child abuse specialist at Randall Children's Hospital. At the hearing, Washington County Deputy District Attorney Megan Johnson told the court that evidence would show that Jessica and Brian watched Zachary
dying before their eyes,
but waited an unreasonable period of time to seek medical help for him. Brian delivered the kick that killed him and had previously abused him, she said, but his mother engaged in a
pattern and practice of assault and torture
against Zachary. By the end of the hearing, Brian was denied bail, but the judge deferred his decision for Jessica and was expected to issue a written warning the following week. Ultimately, the judge ruled that Jessica could not be held without bail, saying in his written ruling,
"The court has re-reviewed the evidence. The court determines that the state has not met its burden of proof to establish a no-security hold."
The following month, Jessica's bail was set at $500,000. Before she had the chance to raise that kind of money, however, on June 4, 2013, based on new information prosecutors had received about the case, Jessica was indicted on 1 count of murder, 5 counts of murder by abuse, and 1 count of second-degree assault, while Brian was indicted on 1 count of murder, 4 counts of murder by abuse, and 1 count of second-degree assault. On these new charges, both were held without bail. In early 2014, a huge development shook the case when on March 4th, 24-year-old Brian Canady, cuffed and shackled in an orange jail jumpsuit, appeared in court with his attorneys, Noah Horst and Ethan Levi, to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter and second-degree assault. During the hearing, although he drastically changed his original story of what happened to Zachary, Brian admitted to committing child abuse that killed his girlfriend's 4-year-old son, and, as a condition of his plea deal, agreed to testify against Jessica Dutro, who he now said he witnessed kicking and stomping Zachary. Brian's charges of murder and murder by abuse were dismissed as a result of his plea. During the hearing, Megan Johnson, by that time Senior Deputy District Attorney for Washington County, told the court that if Brian's case had gone to trial, jurors would not have heard his critical admission to detectives, so the state offered Brian a plea deal stipulating that he testify against Jessica. In his plea petition, Brian wrote that he recklessly caused 4-year-old Zachary serious physical injury and death. In the manslaughter charge, Brian admitted to engaging in a pattern of abuse against Zachary. Although Brian was not sentenced at that hearing, his plea deal assured that as long as he testified to the same statement he gave detectives earlier that week, he would receive a sentence of just 12.5 years in prison with credit for time served. He would not, however, be eligible for any other time reduction programs, such as for good behavior. Circuit Judge Dawn Letourneau accepted the guilty plea and deferred Brian's sentencing until after Jessica's trial was complete. The week after Brian's plea hearing, jury selection began for Jessica's trial, which was scheduled to begin later in March. Meanwhile, prosecutor Megan Johnson filed a motion with the court to subpoena Brian as an incarcerated witness to appear in court on March 27th. Voir dire in Jessica's trial began on March 11, 2014. She was represented by attorneys Chris Colburn and Scott Sharp. The trial itself began on Monday, March 24, 2014. In his opening statement, Deputy District Attorney Dustin Statton told the jury that Jessica ran her family
like an army,
taking discipline to an abusive and violent extreme. Her children were exceedingly well behaved, marching in single file from their living quarters in the homeless shelter to the communal dining table. When they were finished eating, they quietly rested their heads on the table. Jessica's abusive history began before she met Brian, the prosecutor said, telling the jury about her conviction in Hawaii for assaulting her mother's foster son in 2008. By 2012, she was abusing her own children, including Zachary, who he said was gravely ill in the early morning hours of August 14, 2012. By the time an ambulance was called, Zachary was dying. When he arrived at the hospital, he was covered in bumps and bruises, but the two most grievous injuries were consistent with assault and blunt force trauma, those being the 2 holes torn in Zachary's intestines that seeped fluids into his abdomen, causing his death. Prosecutor Staton said that in Brian Canady's original statement, he took the blame for his girlfriend, but in his new statement, he learned of Zachary's fatal injury when Jessica called him and told him she'd given Zachary a lickin' for misbehaving. When the investigation began, the prosecutor said, police immediately saw signs of abuse on Zachary's 7-year-old sister and 3-year-old brother as well. The 3-year-old had multiple fractured ribs at the time of Zachary's death. The only uninjured child, he said, was the infant son Jessica shared with Brian. The 7-year-old told investigators that she saw Brian and her mother beating Zachary before he died. She said some of her own injuries were caused by beatings from her mother. In the defense's opening argument, defense attorney Chris Colburn said that Jessica did not hurt her children.
You're going to hear, in short, a collection of things about Jessica Dutro, and none of them are going to be horribly flattering. And you're going to hear some stuff that references some unusual parenting. But you won't hear from a single credible source that Jessica Dutro caused serious physical injury or murdered her child.
He agreed that her children were raised in a quite regimented fashion. Contrary to both Brian's and the 7-year-old's stories, however,
a lickin'
meant a mere spanking. As for Brian, Colburn said, the jury would find his new story less than credible. In August of 2012, Brian gave a perfectly logical explanation for Zachary's injuries, a description that adequately explained the injuries because it was true, Colburn said. Colburn explained to the jury that a day after the deadly kick, on Zachary's birthday, Jessica took Zachary to the shelter cafeteria for taco night, although the little boy could only take 1 bite of his taco. Thinking he had the flu, she took him back to the room to lie down. Only Brian, Colburn insisted, knew Zachary was gravely injured. Brian noted Zachary was
a little wobbly
in the middle of the night, but Brian did nothing about it. Colburn said that by the end of the trial, it would be obvious who delivered the kick that killed Zachary.
By the end of this trial, you will have heard no credible evidence that Jessica Dutro assaulted and killed Zachary. We will ask you to find her not guilty of the charges she now faces.
I'll be right back after a word from my sponsors. On day 2 of the trial, which took place on Tuesday, March 25, 2014, jurors heard a recording of a police interview with Jessica's 7-year-old daughter, who I'll call A.D. She told the detective how Zachary
got dead. Jessica and Brian, they kept hitting him and punching him. He didn't listen to them, so they kicked him and punched him and stuff, and they kept doing it and doing it.
The kids were often hit, A.D. said, for
not being good.
Once when Zachary was in trouble, she said,
they kept hitting and hitting him because he wasn't listening.
After that, her little brother got sick, began making soft groaning sounds, and eventually stopped breathing. Her mother and Brian knew Zachary was sick, she said,
but they didn't tell anybody.
The same day, the court heard testimony from Dr. Danny Leonhardt, pediatrician and child abuse expert from Randall Children's Hospital, who testified that by the time he saw Zachary, he was beyond help.
We didn't see him until he was essentially dead. We didn't get a chance to fix him.
The doctor testified that Zachary's bowel was torn in 2 places, and the contents of his intestines, which the doctor said consisted of
toxic pre-fecal matter,
had leaked out into Zachary's body for at least 2 days. The resulting shock and infection killed him. Doctors determined that abdominal trauma had caused the tears in Zachary's bowel. Such injuries could be caused by high-velocity car crashes or bike accidents. Otherwise, it would take forceful, violent kicking or stomping to cause them. In the opinion of medical staff at Randall Children's, Zachary's injuries were caused by abuse. In addition to the intestinal perforations, the doctor testified, Zachary's body was covered in bruises that gave doctors the impression the little boy had curled himself into the fetal position to protect himself from a vicious beating. Various injuries in different stages of healing indicated he had been abused multiple times. Dr. Leonhardt was also a child abuse specialist for CARES Northwest, also known as Child Abuse Response and Evaluation Services, which is a collaborative, community-based medical program. Another of Zachary's injuries described by Dr. Leonhardt was old, dead tissue from a previous deep cut that just hung off Zachary's lip. Dr. Leonhardt could not even recall another case where a child had had that kind of injury, because most children, he said, would have been brought in for emergency care when the wound occurred.
That thing would have bled a lot. You just let that flap of lip hang there?
The doctor said medical staff tried their best to save Zachary, but by the time he arrived at the hospital, the damage was already too great. As he was working on Zachary's case, he ran into Zachary's aunt and younger brother in the hospital and noticed the 3-year-old's face was covered in bruises. He also evaluated Zachary's siblings, diagnosing all but the youngest as suffering from child abuse. The 3-year-old had 5 broken ribs in at least 2 different stages of healing, again indicating multiple instances of abuse. The 7-year-old had extensive bruising on her chest, back, buttocks, and hip. The most damning testimony from Dr. Leonhardt came when he was asked about Jessica's reaction when he informed her of his diagnosis of child abuse. He said she became
very angry, very upset,
that he hadn't told her and Brian sooner about the details of Zachary's injuries. Jessica, he said, was infuriated that he hadn't told them prior to their police interview, which she now felt made them look like idiots. The doctor even wrote down what she said next because it was something he had never heard before and struck him as highly unusual. She told Dr. Leonhardt that,
had they been made aware, they would have been able to talk to each other and get their story straight.
Wednesday, March 26th, brought testimony from more witnesses. After the jury was released for the day, the prosecution asked the judge to admit into evidence a Facebook message from Jessica to Brian. Prosecutor Megan Johnson argued the message established Jessica's motive for inflicting on Zachary a pattern of torture and abuse above and beyond the abuse she inflicted on 2 of her other children. She told the judge that in the opinion of the prosecution team, Jessica's motive for subjecting Zachary to daily beatings was that she believed her 4-year-old son was gay. To the great chagrin of the defense, the judge ruled the Facebook message admissible, as well as web searches thought to be conducted by Jessica. On August 16, 2012, the day Zachary's life support was removed, cell phone evidence indicated that Jessica searched terms such as
anger management
and
parenting classes,
as well as accessing Craigslist posts advertising free items and sex with strangers. The internet activity in question did not come up the following day, however, which was instead focused on the testimony of Jessica's daughter, A.D., who was by that time 8 years old. Wearing a pink t-shirt and jeans, the girl told the court that her mother used to give her and her preschool-aged brothers
lickings
when they misbehaved. The lickings, she said, hurt and often left marks on their bodies. She and her 2 brothers, she said, were put in time out for long stretches, forced to face the wall with their hands in the air, and if their arms dropped, Jessica or Brian would hit them. In the audio and video recordings of her one-on-one interviews with investigators, the little girl was talkative, but in court, under the scrutiny of the jury, the judge, lawyers, a gallery full of spectators, and her mother, she spoke softly and often gave monosyllabic answers to the attorney's questions. Her mother, A.D. testified, said she shouldn't talk to anyone about getting hit. When asked if she remembered a time when Zachary was hit in the stomach, she said she did, but she couldn't remember specifics. Now, the girl said, she and her 2 surviving brothers lived with their maternal relatives, an arrangement she described as fun. On Friday, March 28, 2014, jurors finally heard about the Facebook messages between Jessica and Brian containing some of the pair's daily correspondence while one was at home and the other at work. In some of the messages, she expressed frustration with her children, swearing and calling them names like
stupid.
During one incident described in the messages, Jessica told Brian that her daughter upset her by falling asleep on top of the laundry the girl was supposed to be folding.
After an hour, I go in there and her sweaty ass is sleeping on top of the clothes. Sleeping is one thing, but to plop her dirty ass on the clean clothes and sleep.
Jessica later wrote that she gave her lickins, and subsequently, the laundry was done.
Amazing, right?
In one message, she wrote that her third child, who was by that time 2, was
facing the wall
because he had an accident in his pants. She later wrote that the little boy stood against the wall for 2 hours, and that she would have left him in his soiled pants, but she forced her daughter to change him so he wouldn't stink. In another message, Jessica wrote that Zachary, then age 3, was
facing the wall.
Using a homophobic slur, Jessica wrote that Zachary was going to be gay, adding,
"He walks like it and talks like it. Ugh. It pisses me off.
Brian needed to
work on him, big time."
After the news of the existence of that message was reported in the Oregonian the day before, Jessica's case had gone viral, pulling in comments from all over the internet and the world. Multiple media outlets ran stories about the mother who killed her 4-year-old son because she thought he was gay. As a result, defense attorney Scott Sharp asked the judge to reconsider his previous ruling about the message being admitted into evidence, saying the public response showed the material was highly prejudicial. The judge declined, simply replying,
"No way."
At the end of the day Friday, court was recessed for the weekend, set to resume Tuesday, April 1st. On Tuesday morning, the court heard testimony from more witnesses, including another resident from the homeless shelter, who testified that her 4-year-old daughter heard a loud noise coming from Jessica and Brian's room at the time when Zachary was allegedly being abused by Brian. Beaverton Police Detective Michael Hanada, who examined the couple's laptop and phones, also testified, saying Jessica had been searching for several items online while Zachary was in the hospital. Jessica, the detective said, searched
anger management
and trolled the Craigslist free stuff section, as well as looking at homes and jobs on the site. James Gurul, the counselor treating 8-year-old AD, testified that after a few months of counseling, the girl made a spontaneous disclosure about the abuse that went on in the home and her brother's death. Pointing to a picture she'd drawn of her mom and Brian, she said,
"They're in jail right now. Zach is okay with us. Them or not. They would punch me and slap me. They beat my brother up, and then he died. I seen them."
After presenting its last witness, the state rested its case. The same afternoon, the defense began presenting its case, focusing on pinning the blame for Zachary's death squarely on Brian Canady. Both sides had originally planned to call Brian to testify against Jessica, but by this point, it had been decided by both parties that his testimony would not be reliable and that he would not be called to testify at all. On Wednesday, April 2, 2014, closing arguments were presented. During the state's closing, prosecutor Megan Johnson told jurors that Jessica and Brian together committed the fatal beating of little Zachary, arguing that Jessica assaulted her son and then let him die because his mere presence angered her. In Jessica's home, the prosecutor said, child discipline was extreme and violent. Jessica subjected her children to
systematic dehumanization
through brutal beatings, her chosen method of discipline.
What happens if you're not a good listener in Jessica Dutro's home? You get beat.
Jessica made it obvious both she and her boyfriend participated in Zachary's killing when she got angry at the doctor, insisting he should have told her about his abuse findings sooner so she and Brian could have gotten their story straight before talking to police. Prosecutor Johnson argued that the evidence against Jessica was
overwhelming
and
crushing,
reminding the jury that AD witnessed the fatal beating and that her testimony was among the most convincing evidence. If jurors believed nothing else, Ms. Johnson said, they should believe Zachary's sister. The prosecutor also reminded jurors of the photos they'd seen of the children's injuries and the medical testimony they'd heard.
You saw the pictures of those children's little bodies that day. If all you had was picture after picture after picture of their little bodies, would you really need anything more? I suspect not.
With his bowel leaking toxic pre-fecal matter, the prosecutor said, Zachary was in extreme pain before his death. As he went into septic shock, he would have struggled to move. He would not have been eating, walking, talking, or acting normally. He would have started vomiting profusely. His grave illness would have been obvious, which, she said, it was to his sister. The little girl knew more than any child her age should, Prosecutor Johnson said.
She looked up at the nurse and said, "At least I have other brothers." That is evidence that she knew her brother was going to die.
As for Jessica, Ms. Johnson said,
Jessica Dutro's lies are narcissistic and offensive, and it gives you a glimpse into who could do something like this. Her concern throughout is for herself and her own skin, and not her dying son. Zachary literally dies so that she wouldn't have to self-report. They beat him to death, and she allowed him to die in that room, in her presence, so that she wouldn't have to admit to having hurt him.
After the state concluded, defense attorney Chris Colburn delivered the defense's closing argument, saying there was no evidence that Jessica fatally assaulted her son. Even though Brian's statements had
evolved,
Colburn said, the evidence still pointed to him as the sole aggressor.
It is evident beyond a reasonable doubt who delivered the blows to Zachary Dutro-Boggess. It is also evident that the state has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Jessica Dutro who delivered those blows. It is clear beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brian Canady did it.
Why did Brian take a plea deal? Colburn asked.
He was facing life with a minimum of 25 years, and he was given his life back. They said, all we want is for you to testify against Jessica Dutro. And even at the end of that, he could not provide a narrative that made the state comfortable they could put him on the stand.
Regarding Zachary's older sister, Colburn argued that the girl's testimony couldn't be trusted, saying she had been tainted by adults who talked to her about the case.
Don't confuse bravery and courage and charm and sympathy with reliability, because we have to decide if her story is reliable, not just in broad strokes.
About evidence presented that Jessica was cold and unemotional as her son lay dying in the hospital, Colburn explained,
It's poppycock. It's not legitimate. What, at that point, is Ms. Dutro supposed to do? Is she supposed to hang on his every second with the hope that his eyelids flutter?
She did not seek medical help for Zachary, he said, because she didn't know he needed it.
All the evidence that you've heard in the last 8 days has suggested, if not proven to you, that she was not aware of and did not disregard a substantial risk that Zachary was that ill.
The Facebook message, Colburn said, didn't prove motive on Jessica's part, and making the assumption that she abused Zachary because she thought he was gay was absurd.
Keep in mind the context of that statement and how it was received. The immediate response is LOL, laughing out loud, indicating that the recipient at least thought it was a joke. Is it a funny joke? No. Is it a joke anyone else would make? No. Is it proof she had unrealistic expectations of her children? Absolutely not. Is it motive for beating her child to death? That is patently ridiculous.
In another message, Colburn pointed out, she asked Brian not to hit the kids, and nothing in the messages suggested that Jessica assaulted them either. Any motive the state presented was irrelevant anyway, he argued, because she didn't commit the crime. After closing arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate at around 3:45 p.m. The primary questions they had to answer were, did Jessica subject her son, Zachary, to a pattern of abuse that ended in a deadly beating? And, knowing Zachary was fatally injured, did Jessica fail to summon medical help and allow him to die before her own eyes? These were not, evidently, difficult questions to answer. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning with a unanimous verdict at about 5:15 p.m., finding Jessica Dutro guilty on all counts, including 1 count of murder, 5 counts of murder by abuse, and 1 count of second-degree assault. Jessica, wearing a zebra print t-shirt and black pants, sat between defense attorneys Chris Colburn and Scott Sharp. She showed no visible reaction to her guilty verdict. And now for a final word from my sponsors. The sentencing hearing for both Jessica Dutro and Brian Canady took place on Friday, April 18, 2014, in Washington County Circuit Court. Prior to the beginning of the hearing, prosecutors displayed a poster-sized picture of Zachary's smiling, surviving siblings. When Brian entered the room, his eyes froze on the image. As Jessica entered, Brian watched her take her seat with her attorneys at the defense table. He sat with his attorneys in the jury box for the entirety of the hearing. Both convicted killers wore jail scrubs and handcuffs, and both declined to speak during the hearing. Jessica's parents and sisters, with whom her children by that time were living, wrote a statement, read aloud during the hearing by Prosecutor Dustin Staton. In Jessica and Brian's care, the family wrote, the children were ruled by violence and lacked any joy.
These 4 beautiful children lived every day in fear if they would be beat or not.
After Zachary died, when his siblings went to live with their grandparents, they showed obvious signs of neglect. The two boys didn't move or play like children their age, and all three surviving children were behind in their physical, social, and educational development. Slowly, in the care of loving family members, they'd begun to catch up. A.D., they said, was a sweet, caring third grader. Her 4-year-old brother
rarely ever stops talking
and
plays joyfully with his many friends.
The baby, by that time aged 2, learned,
on fast forward,
to hold himself up, crawl, and walk. In Zachary's memory, the family wanted to draw attention to child abuse and neglect, saying,
"His short life will always be cherished, not forgotten."
At the conclusion of the hearing, Jessica was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 25 years. Her life sentence was mandated by Measure 11, a ballot measure approved by voters in November of 1994, applying mandatory minimum prison sentences to certain crimes committed after April 1, 1995, with no possibility for any reduction in sentence, such as for good behavior. While delivering Jessica's sentence, Judge Don Letourneau said,
"Parents are supposed to protect their kids, and you were the most dangerous thing in your kids' lives."
He told Jessica she'd failed to learn from her assault conviction in Hawaii and the court-ordered parenting classes she took there.
"And then you made an 8-year-old come here and testify in front of a jury when you had no triable case. That is low."
Before Brian was sentenced, Jessica was led out of the courtroom weeping. Rest assured, those tears were not of remorse for the son she brutally murdered. They were selfish tears for the years she would lose behind bars. While handing down Brian's sentence, Judge Letourneau told him that in terms of dangerousness to the children, he was
a close second
to Jessica, adding,
"That's a very slim distinction."
As dictated by his plea agreement, Brian was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison with credit for time served. Now 33, Brian Cody Canady, Oregon Department of Corrections SID 19633495, is listed on the DOC website as being of white or European origin with brown hair and green eyes, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing 160 pounds. Brian is currently serving his sentence in the South Fork Forest Camp in Tillamook, Oregon, with his earliest release date set as February 20, 2025. Soon after her conviction, Jessica filed an appeal requesting a new trial. Her attorneys claimed in the appeal brief that the judge shouldn't have admitted
highly inflammatory
Facebook messages in which she used a gay slur to refer to Zachary. Although the message showed her
discomfort with homosexuality,
it didn't establish a motive to hurt her son. The brief also claimed that evidence at trial didn't warrant a jury finding that Jessica showed an extreme indifference to the value of human life, and the judge should have allowed her to make an unsworn statement to the jury. In December of 2016, Jessica's appeal was denied by the Oregon Court of Appeals. 33-year-old Jessica Anilani Dutro, Oregon Department of Corrections SID 19633506, is incarcerated in the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, where she is serving her life sentence. She is listed as Asian, with black hair and brown eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 199 pounds. Coffee Creek is also the permanent home of another terrible mother I recently talked about, Stella Kaiser, who, along with her boyfriend, Jesse Compton, was convicted of the 1997 torture and murder of Stella's 3-year-old daughter, Teslyn O'Cull. Sadly, there's not that much information out there about Zachary Dutro-Boggess. His father, Zachary Sr., told reporter Emily Smith that Zachary was loved, adding,
"He was a really happy child."
The very best description I found of Zachary was from foster mother Kate Cruz, who took Zachary into her home in Hawaii when he was 4 months old. Describing Zachary as a
sweet guy,
Kate said,
"He learned to walk, talk, and laugh in my home. He had a sneaky little giggle when he thought he was hiding from you. He loved to be chased and tickled. I called him the kissing bandit because he loved to be snuggled and kissed. He would leave his play and run across the room to get a kiss, then go back to play. Everyone who met him just wanted to hold and hug him. He was a typical boy who tended to gravitate to trucks, cars, and loud noises. He was a little troublemaker to his sister and my daughter because he always wanted to be right in the middle of their play. He had such an infectious giggle that you had to laugh with him, no matter the mood you were in. He was so loved and valued."
On August 14, 2020, the 8th anniversary of Zachary's last hospitalization, Kate posted a photo of him wearing a red plastic fire helmet on her Facebook page, along with the caption,
"Zachary Dutro-Boggess, you are never forgotten."
I second that sentiment. We will never forget you, Zachary. My sources for this episode were The Oregonian, The Times, Oregon.gov, Murderpedia, Find a Grave, and the Oregon Judicial Department's online records search portal. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode and the conclusion of my Pride Month coverage. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes or become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook and Instagram. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. All music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. If you see something, say something. Until next week, bye everyone.